Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle a jungle fighter from January's Digital Forge from Anvil Industry. This is a 3D print. He came off of my Elegoo Mars 2 Pro. But it's worth pointing out, if you don't have a printer at home, there are already jungle fighter parts available in resin from Anvil Industry. For example, let's just chuck those in the back there. So even if you don't have a printer, you can grab most of what you're going to see here. At the moment, this fancy pulse rifle thing spinning around is STL only, but as with most of the digital releases, Anvil will eventually come out with these in resin. So if you don't have a printer, a little patience and you'll be able to paint these up how you like. Now this is inspired by the Colonial Marines from the Aliens franchise. I stuck a little too close to it, I think, and it could look a little better, but I'm still pretty pleased with how it turned out. So those of you who have asked, how would I paint the Colonial Marines from, what is the name of the game? Another Day in the Corps, I think it is. This is how. I would likely change one of the browns, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below, along with the base recipe too, for those of you who want to see that. Let's get started. So after assembly, the very first thing I've done is to give this guy a primer spray of Zandri dust. Now, common question is whether or not that needs to have another color on underneath first, and the short answer is no. The Citadel and the Army Painter primers, they are designed as, well, primers. You don't need to put a white or a black down first. Makes it very easy. What I've got now is we're going to go ahead and paint on his skin, because we are probably going to make a bit of a mess of this as we go, but it will be easier to lay down this foundation and then make any tidy up we need to do, rather than carefully avoiding the skin later on. So for this I'm using tanned flesh from the Army Painter. You'll see this goes on fairly well. On some of the larger areas, like on these biceps, you're probably going to need to come back and give it a second coat. But you can be the judge of that once you've seen how this one dries. Now I have applied 2 coats there to give myself a nice solid surface. Like I said, if I do make a mistake later, that's going to be easier for cleanup. Now I'm going to stick to the Army Painter range for a couple of steps here. I have combat fatigues, and there isn't really something quite like this in the Citadel range. Nurgling Green is probably the closest, but that is a little bit darker and a much more saturated green. What we're looking for is a lighter, slightly faded green for his fatigues to start off with. And while I'm doing this, I know lots of us grew up with, James Cameron's Aliens, Ridley Scott's Alien, Colonial Marines and all that, but this is a stupid uniform. Like, what on earth is this uniform actually optimizing for? What environment do they intend to fight in? It is a confused mishmash. I love it, but we must accept it as absolute bonk. But let's have some fun with it. Probably going to need a couple of coats of this jank, and we'll come back and get a look at that in a second. Now, one thing I've found when painting on the lighter Army Painter colors, particularly ones like Skeleton Bone or Combat Fatigues as we've used here, you need to be a little more trusting of them. They have a slightly creamy texture, so the first coat that goes on is going to smear and look terrible, to be perfectly honest. But when you apply the second, leave it for a couple of seconds, and that creaminess, it sort of settles, and it will look much better than you expect going on. So have some faith with it. Now we're going to move on and start applying the camo pattern itself. And for this, we're going to turn to Baneblade Brown. Now, this is not technically accurate. The actual color, like I've got one of the screen tests for Private Hudson's uniform, and it should instead be like a stone color. It's a little bit more green than what I'm going to use here. But if we stick to what is exactly seen on screen, then when we apply it to our miniatures, that difference is going to disappear. So instead, we need to exaggerate that. I've got here one of the most rancid, raggedy old brushes I have. And I'm going to get some Baneblade Brown and just dab it a little onto a bit of kitchen towel so that I'm going to get a rough finish when I apply this. So you'll see we're just going to stab it on fairly randomly. You want probably about 1/3 of the green covered with this. Now try and be as random as you can with this, but don't worry too much if you do end up making familiar shapes, I tend to find that I end up randomly creating a lot of L shapes when I'm doing this, but it works fine once it's shaded. Now looking at them from behind is going to give us the easiest view of what that ought to look like. You'll see that the ragged brush gives us a really, ragged finish, and it almost looks more like digital camo. Really good way to cheat that if you're looking at painting some modern stuff. I have here Skavenblight Dinge, and we're going to paint in, it's almost a stone color in some of these areas. So this you'll find there's much less of, and we want to cross over between areas of brown and grey. So brown and green rather. So keeping your brush essentially wiggling, you want to pretend you're a tattoo artist. Just add a few little splotches here and there. This will very quickly overpower what you've done, so try not to go overboard with it. Now if you're having a problem making these little random squiggles, best thing you can do is to spend a couple of minutes on your palette stabbing your brush around, get an impression of what you're going to leave behind. Now the final stage on the fatigues themselves is actually going to be a little bit of white, but that will also appear on the armour. So we'll do the armour, most of it now, and for this I'm going to turn to Deathcore Drab, which is a really wonderful green colour. You could stick to Castellan green if that's something that you've got access to, but this is, I mean, look at this going on. This is Colonial Marines green, so I'm going to give this a couple of coats to his armour. Now when it comes to the camo on the armour, this is a different pattern again to what is on the fatigues, not just colour-wise, but this is more long stripes, long squiggly stripes down the armour. So I'm going to start with a little bit of Mournfang brown, and I will just paint some squiggles which taper off a little as I lift off my brush. With a little bit of XV88, we're now going to do the same thing as we did with the fatigues, and that is to cross over some of these areas with a little bit of this brighter colour now. Little splotches that mix things up. Now once you've got all your blobs and squiggles, we're going to turn to some white scar. Now this you want quite a fine brush for, and just a little bit on your brush as you're working. That's probably a bit much, to be perfectly honest. What we're going to paint is just some little tiny wee scuff shapes which kind of follow and cross into some of these areas. So up on his shoulder here, let's go for a little C shape and then just flick away a little to get some randomness to these shapes. Now that will look quite sharp at the moment, but remember we are going to shade it. We're going to do the same thing again on the fatigues. As always, water this paint down just a little bit more than you normally would. You don't want the coverage to be perfect here. So I'm going to do just tiny little flicks here and there. Not very much of this at all, just to border some of these areas. And I will make sure that they aren't straight like they are on the armour. At the moment, that is going to look really sharp, but again, once we've shaded it, that's going to not be so much of a problem. Now, there are more colours. These guys are so many colours. I have here Deathworld Forest, and we're going to paint in the casing on his pulse rifle. Now, these ones are a little bit different, of course, from the, they're not movie accurate, but they're very clearly evocative. So pick which areas you think are going to look best in green, and one quick coat of this over Zandri dust will normally be plenty. For his webbing and his pouches, we're going to turn to Deathguard green. Now I'm going to use Rhinox hide as a nice, dark, slightly warm red on his boots. You can pick whichever leather colour you really like here, to be perfectly honest, but this is what I'm going to go for. Now, while I was thinking of Hudson's uniform, I remember all the little personal effects that he's got sort of stenciled onto his armour. So this bandana this guy's got round his neck, I'm actually going to paint in Evil Sunz Scarlet. I figure a big splash of a really bright colour. Up top around his helmet, he has got a single strap which is holding on things like this playing card and the ammo that he's got there. I'm going to use a little Baneblade brown and take my time going around here. Now that Baneblade brown being the same color we've used earlier for the camo, it will fade a little bit into the rest of the helmet, but we'll highlight that later to make that pop. I've gone over the ammo there with a little bit of Retributor armor, and the playing card with a bit of patience and a tiny brush. I cannot do that one on screen, unfortunately, folks, but you can have a shot with that if you like. I've got now some black, and I'm going to fill in the working parts of this pulse rifle. And once I'm finished with that, I'm going to go ahead and just do any last minute tidy up I need to do before we move on to our next stage. Now once you've done any of your cleanup and all of those colours have had plenty of time to dry, I've shaken up my Agrax Earthshade really thoroughly, and we are going to apply this, no big surprise, over the entire miniature. Now you don't want to let it collect too heavily in any one place, so if you get a big pool, while it's still wet, just shift it around. You will see in a little bit why I've opted for tanned flesh for the skin color to start with, rather than something like Bugman's Glow, but we'll see. If you're worried about applying too much of this, what you ought to do is either print yourself off a pair of legs or something, a spare essentially, put a couple of coats of combat fatigues on it and then shade it, and see how much you want to apply to get the right effect here. But I'm going to go around now, shade the whole miniature, and then we'll give him about 30 minutes to dry. Once it has dried, you can have something that looks like this, and as you can see, what a difference a shade makes. Now, the difference between the brown and the green on the trousers becomes a little difficult to see on the camera here. In reality, this is a little bit more visible. If you did want a sharper difference between those two, then I'd suggest instead of Baneblade brown, use something like Steel Legion Drab. Just a darker brown will do instead. What we're going to do is just a couple of highlights. We're not going to bother about highlighting any of the clothing because the camo pattern would really hide most of that. So instead we're going to go straight to his skin. And I have here a little bit of Cadian flesh tone. And here I think you'll see, starting from tanned flesh, instead of having to come back with some Bugman's Glow again, having shaded it, it's still quite nice and warm. Bugman's Glow, once it's shaded with Agrax Earthshade, it tends to look a little dirty to me. But this works quite nicely. In some areas, especially big flat areas like on the shoulders, you're going to find you will need to come back and give this a second coat. But just because they're so big, it's pretty easy to highlight these guys. Move on now to a little bit of Kislev flesh, because I like the whole faces and bases idea. As long as your skin, your faces and that are painted and your bases are done with something a little interesting, they'll normally look just fine. So we're going to pick out just cheekbones, tip of his nose, and so forth. This guy's got quite a pronounced Buzz Lightyear chin, so let's go ahead and give him the butt chin to match. Now we'll keep the rest of his highlights deliberately fairly simple. I've got here some Fire Dragon Bright, and I'm going to use this just to pick out the big creases in his bandana. When it comes to the rifle, I'm going to use some Strachan Green. You could actually go all the way up to Nurgling Green. That's quite a pale green-grey colour. And then finally, we'll use a little bit of Iron Warriors just to brighten up some of the edges of the metal detail. So these black bits will make them shine a little with just a little of this metallic here. Now once this is done, I'm going to go ahead and hit him with a matte varnish. I'm going to use the Vallejo matte spray for that. Go ahead and pop a base on him. So once all that's done, let's get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished. And there at last, our Colonial Marine is complete. Now in truth, I have cut a fair few corners to actually get here. I've skipped out on highlighting a few things I ordinarily would, but I think once you've done so much work on camouflage for, two separate parts of a miniature, you can afford to cut some of those corners. People's eye is going to be drawn to the interesting parts. So feel free to draw the eye and save yourself a little bit of work in other places. Usually really effective if you are doing large infantry armies in a similar way. Likewise, in the future, I would probably use a slightly darker brown for the brown sections on the camouflage. I think I have stuck a little too close to the movie pattern, essentially, and should have just taken that as inspiration rather than essentially a guideline. But one way or the other, I'm still pretty happy with the end result, and I think it's recognizable what he's supposed to be. So again, these are the January files available from Anvil Industries Digital Forge. I'll make sure that the link to the Patreon is in the description, and once this is all over, you'll be able to go and pick those up from the Anvil Industries site whenever you fancy. They will be available for general sale later, but if you want to save a few dollars, you're better off to grab them through the Patreon when you can. Likewise, there's also a discount code available for patrons, so if you do want to go back and grab, say, a few old packs of STLs, you're probably worth picking up a Patreon subscription, even if it's only for a month, just for that discount code. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me do this cool stuff. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.